soy Gŵyl Haf. Welcome to Gŵyl Haf and to one of our lunchtime series of talks. Today with me I have writer, poet and translator Robin Myers, returning for her second appearance at Gŵyl Haf.
Oh, it's so lovely to be back. Thank you, Caitlin.
Oh, such an obvious choice. Um, we just
Honored.
delighted by everything you had to say last year. If you'd like to, do check out Robin's talk after this one. After you've watched this one in its entirety, we'll go give her a look there as well from last year. So today we are going to be reading some poems, or I am not. I am going to be listening to poems. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you have for us today.
Yes, and thank you again, Caitlin, for this wonderful invitation. And I'm also just so grateful for the chance to do something that I don't usually get to do, which is read both poems of my own, poems that I have translated, and just a few poems that I simply admire, that I have no professional connection to, but that I just love. So I'm going to be doing exactly that in an exactly that order. A few of my own, several translations by both Argentine and Mexican poets, and then to close with a few other of my current recent favorite poems.
Is everything from Spanish or English? Or is it all from Spanish?
Everything that I've translated is from Spanish, and the poems I'm going to read at the end are all originally written in English, but from writers from different backgrounds and places.
Fantastic. Well, without further ado, then, shall we begin?
Thank you so much. Um, I am going to be reading initially three poems that have not appeared in book form. One of them is very recent, the first one, and it's very brief. I'm not going to say a great deal about any of the poems, but may just add a little comment here and there. So here is this first fairly new poem called "We've Been Discussing What It Would Mean to Have a Child in These of All Times." Inside the third zucchini is a reddish worm, ribbed, ready as a joystick, flailing as if rattled from a long sleep. Behemoth, mortal, I put down the paring knife for a better look. Does it take the open air for a roaring wind? What will it eat here? What will it do now? I'm going to continue with a poem that I wrote a number of years ago about Palestine, which is a place where I lived for a while, more years ago. And it's a poem about language and about the different space and weight and role of different languages in a multilingual space. Al Khalil. You had to pass through a checkpoint outside the mosque where the massacre had been. The soldiers took our passports and vanished, which meant we weren't going anywhere soon. Another at the entrance sat high as a lookout on a ship. Like most translators, he was the good cop. He greeted the women politely, knew the names of little boys, joked about soccer in Arabic. Shadi watched him darkly. He'd never been to Al Khalil before, and it was some time before he'd tell me what they'd said to each other. Where are you from? Asked the soldier in Hebrew. Haifa, said Shadi in Arabic. Really? Said the soldier in Hebrew. What street? Abbas, said Shadi in Arabic. Look at that, said the soldier in Hebrew. We're neighbors. And gesturing to the checkpoint, how long have you been waiting here? 60 years, said Shadi in Hebrew. You know what, said the soldier in Hebrew, you people should be grateful to us. Before we came, you didn't even have cars, just camels. Shadi's grandfather had been a taxi driver in Arabic. Shadi said nothing in anything. IDs returned. We made our way down a road where everything was stony and gray and charged with a sort of static unease. Skinny cats, a child with one arm, a father who pulled him closer when he saw us. We walked until we met another soldier. An older boy, maybe 12, hovered by the curb. Where are you going? Asked the soldier in Hebrew. We're just walking, said Shadi in Hebrew. You have to go back, said the soldier in Hebrew. Then, where are you from? The soldier asked me in English. New York, I said in English. Ah, New York, said the soldier in English. He gestured to the boy. Do you know where that is? The soldier asked the boy in English. America, said the boy in English. America, said the soldier in English. Do you love America? He asked the boy in English. The boy said nothing in anything. Of course, there were other things that day. A child flying a kite on a roof, bolts of black cloth threaded with crimson blooms, sweet cheese, a dense, harsh smoke smell like some kind of fifth circle marijuana, overhead grates veiling the open-air aisles of the old city where settlers would sometimes fling rotting food or raw sewage onto passers-by, a roast chicken restaurant where we asked if I could go in to pee. Shadi's voice in Arabic, greeting the people who told us how to get where we were going, out, as if it were the first time he'd ever come, which, again, it may have been, although I'm not sure that's what he'd say if you asked him. And to end this first part of the reading, this is a poem, a recent-ish poem called A Briefing. It wasn't that I died, obviously, just that a life began and ended with an insectin entirety. 1 minute lustrous, frightening, winged, then somehow swept in a husk against the baseboard or something. And that was that. And then everything else, work, youth, currencies, etc., another love, and who knows how many short-lived half-loves that seeped their chemicals into my things, and the clean crackle of the love that's incited me since, and the occasional untimely revelation, and baked eggs, and friends, and the gray film over the wild city, and the same big want, but bluer now, soft, a hum as sweet as the heart of a mouse. I'm going to change a gear now and read several poems by different poets that I've been working with in recent years, one by each of 4 different poets. The first is named Mariana Espada, who's from Entre Rios, Argentina, but currently lives in Barcelona. And this is a poem from her first book, and it's called Ferreri Livestock. I try yet again to explain what my father did for a living. Let's say there was a problem in the plant, a tube sputtering ammonia, a depressurized bolt gun. It doesn't really matter what. So many things can go awry, and that's inevitable in any submarine or slaughterhouse. So then someone would take the path along the stream, flawed piece in hand, and walk out to the depot where my father was. Years on the job had taught him to know if a replacement part was there among the scores of boxes and find it with a glance. If not, he'd filed the order form. If so, there wasn't much mystery to it. My father would bring in the substitute, compare the new part to the old, and if they matched, he'd sign the sheet and then be left alone again. The lord and master of his afternoons he never used to write short stories or join a union. That was it, pretty much. This is a poem by Isabel Zapata from Mexico, who is both an essayist and a poet and a translator herself. This poem is called Reasons Not to Step on Snails. Because they're both male and female at once. Because their shells grow with them. Because Apicius cooked them with fermented fish guts. Because their slime erases wrinkles. Because they take 3 hours to mate. Because they have 20,000 microscopic teeth. because Pope Pius V declared them fish so Catholics could eat them during Lent, because their naps last all week long, because Leonardo da Vinci ate them with butter and parsley, because they walk with their bellies, because they crunch, because they love unrigidly. This is a poem that I return to often during the pandemic, during the sort of the deepest, darkest, most uncertain months of this crazy year plus we've all had. And it's by the Argentine poet Claudia Macien, who is from Resistencia Chaco in Argentina and now lives in Cordoba. She is a psychoanalyst and poet. The Frost. Anyone who's been hurt carries the damage with her, as if her task were to propagate it, print it onto anyone who comes too close. We're innocent in the face of it, as a frost is innocent of devastating the harvest. Its freeze was already there, inside it, like its need to fall. It waited, forging itself slowly in the sky, in the center of a silence we can't make sense of, for its time to shine, to transpire. How could you stand bearing such weight without the urge to unburden yourself, even if your outburst blighted the earth, houses, lives peaceably sustained in the labor of protecting the world, during long seasons divided between the months of planting and the months of yield? I pray for the might that can withstand catastrophe and remake what's been harmed as many times as necessary. And I pray for the damage that can't be helped, because whatever we give each other, be it sorrow or fear, comes from the same desire to heal and be healed. And this last poem in this section is by the Mexican poet Salo Mochon, and it's called Karma. When I was 5, I thought that if I gave someone an apple, I'd get an apple back. At 7, that if I gave someone an apple, I'd get at least some kind of fruit, a blueberry, a guava, maybe a dash of pepper. At 11, I imagined that if I gave someone an apple, I'd receive at least the promise that they wouldn't rob me of another one. At 15, I realized that if I gave someone an apple, I might not get anything in return. Now I see that if I give someone an apple, I might even receive something more valuable. A bullet, for example, which is made of steel. And now in this final part, I'm going to read 4 very different poems. The first is one of my favorite poems of all time, and the others are poems that I've discovered recently, just in reading on a day-to-day sort of poking around way. And this first one is by the poet James Wright, and it's called Northern Pike. All right. Try this, then. Everybody I know and care for, and everybody else is going to die in a loneliness I can't imagine and a pain I don't know. We had to go on living. We untangled the net. We slit the body of this fish open from the hinge of the tail to a place beneath the chin I wish I could sing of. I would just as soon we let the living go on living. An old poet whom we believe in said the same thing, and so we paused among the dark cattails and prayed for the muskrats, for the ripples below their tails, for the little movements that we knew the crawdads were making underwater, for the right-hand wrist of my cousin who is a policeman. We prayed for the game warden's blindness. We prayed for the road home. We ate the fish. There must be something very beautiful in my body. I am so happy. This poem is by the Iranian-American poet Kaveh Akbar, and it's called Famous Americans and Why They Were Wrong. A ribbon around an oak tree reads, brother, the oak's roots sinking deeper into the earth. A heart can sink too, like a root or a library whose architect forgot to factor in the weight of its books. First you lose romance, then fiction, history. At the center of a heart, it's data, the same idiot degradation that turned the stars into us. I hope somebody forgets you today, too. I hope somebody cuts that ribbon free. This is Petition by Bridget Pegeen Kelly. These are the long weeks, the weeks of waiting. Let them be longer. Let the days smolder like the peat slung in plastic sacks by the greenhouse, and let the seedlings not rush into growth, but climb the air slowly as if it were a ladder, one small foot at a time. Let the fetid smell of bone meal be the body unlocking as the river does, slowing to a hazy laze that pulls the boaters in and makes the fish rise up. And as the wide-wheeled yellow tractors roll along the highway, stalling traffic in their wakes, and the dust from the playing fields settles over to us like pollen, like the balls dropping softly into our midst, let the willow's love of water, its dark and beaded rain, be the only storm we long for. And I'll end with a poem by Aracelis Girmay called On Poetry and History, after Joy Harjo. On a panel of men who spoke about history and poetry, she sat quietly for much of it. They, the men, were saying strong things, good things, but in authoritative voices, voices that knew they knew things, and she remained the only quiet one. She listened as if she weren't listening. Her face looked forward. Her quiet seemed distant. It had a straight back. And then she interrupted one of the men and said something like, "That reminds me of the time," and she spoke of a fellow Native American teacher in her region who committed suicide near the end of one of the years, and how he must have been hurting and isolated and in pain, but not many people spoke about that, or spoke about his death or his loss when he died. It was swept under the rug, that was the phrase she used, and she said she was at home one day and looking out of the window, and she noticed a black thread or string there, floating in the frame, and she observed it for a while, floating there, until she realized that the black string was grief. The grief of the professor, the grief of the students, her own grief, and the grief of silence, a historical grief, and that she knew that it was her job to take the thread and put it somewhere, weave it into the larger tapestry. She made a gesture then, as if that tapestry were just above her head. She said it was her job to put that grief in its place, or else someone else, some child or grown person, would be out walking and just walk right into it, without knowing what it was they'd walked into, what they had then inherited in a way, what they were then carrying and feeling. The danger of that, the grief of that. And that was what she said about poetry and history. And that is all I remember from all of the things that were said that entire day. That's it. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Not only beautifully read, but without, may I know, a single stumble.
Oh, there were some.
Quite impressive and beautifully selected. I think that for me, you got the range of poetry there, and sort of I think I don't know, poetry is different things to different people, but something I think is really nice about it is it often feels like a moment, a sort of a snapshot. That's kind of some of the beauty of its form, is that it isn't more than one thing, but then you put them all together and then you have what feels like the whole spectrum of human experience. And thank you, that was gorgeous.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure truly to get to think about I don't know, sometimes I think of poetry as sort of these little arrows zinging around and to kind of, feel pulled or to feel your attention going in different directions at different moments, as you say. And so it's also a really helpful and beautiful exercise for me to get to sort of pull these things together for a little bit. And I think that's also just one of the gifts of poetry as a form is that it is so um, they're meant to be reread. They're meant to be read in a glancing sort of way, and then maybe forgotten, and then returned to. I mean, there's something very forgiving about the scale, I think, of poetry, which I've always found very comforting.
And the sort of the difference as well between reading on the page and
Yeah.
reading out loud then. And
Yeah.
there are certain things like I know, for example, in the Palestinian poem, I may have on paper, when the repetitions were there in Arabic, in Hebrew, I
Hmm.
would have maybe skimmed them.
Hmm.
That there was a way in which I would have not let that rhythm flow internally, whereas I can't skim when hearing out loud. And it sort of depends on what reading mood you're in. Sometimes you treat a text with the respect it deserves, and other times it's serving a different purpose. So that was beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you so much again for the invitation and for all the incredible things you're doing with this festival, which is just such a joyful and beautiful event, and I admire you so much.
Oh, stop it. Stop it, Robin. We'll have you back again. Before, I'd like to ask a few questions.
Yeah.
Is there anything in those poems? I feel like those poems are relatively simple in their choice of language. Is that something that you do tend to like in poetry? Is there anything else that you feel unifies them, um, other than, in your lovely voice?
Well, yeah, I think that I am drawn to, this is, I guess, hard, it sounds very abstract in a way, but to poems that can, in returning to them, can be that you are always finding new things. And so I think I do, while there is certainly a lot of poetry that's very dense or kind of markedly experimental that I admire enormously and that I love and learn from, I think that both as primarily as a reader of poetry and also what I try to do in my own work is I think often I find it really unfortunate that sort of accessibility is sort of a pejorative term. I don't think it should be, and I think particularly since poetry is often treated in this sort of distant, like, oh God, poetry, that's so, who, what does it even mean, and so I am really drawn to poetry that both has a rich sense of sound and delights in sound and uses sound to make, as a friend says, to make arguments. That a lot of what is happening in the poems that I love, there is something about the material quality of language, not just what is being said, that gets you there. But I also love that I love when there is an invitation, when there isn't a sense of, let's see if you can figure this out, but the sense of inviting the reader to follow the poem along, that sort of shows you where it's going. And so I think I am drawn to poems where that happens both in what they are saying and how they are saying it. Um, what else? I do think that, I mean, I'm certainly interested in poems um, that explore the sort of tensions and invisible communication that happen between people and that happen between people and our environments, that are questioning on some level um, the ways in which we are engaging with each other and the world and our history and our sense of how we fit into our history. So I would say that as well. What we expect, what we take for granted, what we can't anymore take for granted. Yeah.
Maybe not quite you. I mean, the Snail Poem.
I love the snail
I
poem.
love the Snail Poem. What you said about um what your answer there has just made me like you even more than I thought was possible. Because I think that there's nothing more important for me really, I guess, in poetry, as well as this idea that a poem should not be incomprehensible. Like there should be layers, if the author chooses, there should be layers that could be revealed and would like be a pleasure to find out and discover, but like they shouldn't hide the poem should be there and then the layers behind it rather than the layers and then the poem.
Yeah.
Because you know, I have several friends who sort of are big readers and yeah, don't read poetry, and you're like, well, you know, and they like, they don't feel qualified. They feel like, well, I'll get something wrong. It's like a test. It's like a, you know, and sort of also the poetry people are exposed to before they might seek it out themselves is not maybe the poetry we would choose to expose people to as children and as teens. And I wonder if there's any sort of favorite poets you've had recently. So for me, I just discovered Adelia Prado this year. I don't know if you've read her, and
Oh yeah, I need to read more of her. I read a few things that I love, and it's, yes, very much. I'm so glad you've mentioned her. Yeah.
oh my gosh, I felt it was such a surprise find, and I was like,
Mm.
she is. It felt, you know, sometimes it just hits you, and you're like, I get her.
Yeah, yeah, it's such a special thing when you connect that way. Yeah. Um, I would say that one person for me is a poet who died just a couple of years ago, I think, named Linda Gregg, and I think she's an example of what you were just talking about also, in that they're sort of deceptively simple poems, often quite short and very compact, and often describing scenes of nature, or of, you know, that they have a reflective um, tone, you know, and style, and yet there's often just these little sort of electric shocks running through them. And I think also, you know, there's so many ways where we expect, you know, a poem that has some connection to nature that is even in itself either describing a beautiful scene or is beautiful, as sort of automatically pleasant. And they're often, I'm just really interested in how poets who have that sort of attention to the natural world, which I think is so much harder than it sounds like, you know, to sustain, it's full of darkness and questions, and yeah, and so I've been really taken with her recently. And a poet I keep coming back to in recent years also is Terence Hayes, who has, I think, also just, you know, talking about different kinds of poetry that we're exposed to before we would necessarily seek it out in itself, and this idea of, you know, formal poetry, sonnets and rhyme. And Terence Hayes has this absolutely extraordinary sequence of sonnets that all have the same title. I think I should have looked this up, and it was American Sonnet for My Once and Future Assassin. And it's all about, not all of it's about a million things, but just about Trump era United States, about systemic racism, about police violence. And they're just these blistering, endlessly creative poems examining contemporary life, pop culture, politics, but using this form that we think of as so stiff, you know. And he just does something new with it, and continues to improvise on it. And I just think it's so exciting what he does.
Absolutely. Um, um, is there I want to maybe ask next, or I don't know, I'll ask a little bit about your writing process and sort of how, because a couple of those poems were yours.
Mhm.
Is poetry something you write as a practice, or is it something you write within all your other work? You know, I think that like for me it's within all my other work. Like I don't like sit down and say I'm going to write poetry like yoga or something. But I know for many other people it is. And then also what are you working on next and
Mm.
using that writing process on?
Thank you for asking. Writing poetry is sort of my first and greatest love. It is really I just I that's what I want to do forever. And yet, I was thinking the other day about how sort of my professional life has been a series of sort of ludicrous plan Bs, one after another, that I thought, well, I need to do something more stable than writing poetry, like becoming a literary translator. You know, great idea.
So
And
stable, so stable.
so so reliable. Yep. Um, And yet I think, there are two fields that I feel very passionately about and that do feed each other. There's certainly, as a translator of both poetry and prose, there are things in having to involve myself in the language of others and to involve myself in my own recreation, my own interpretation of their texts, that of course strengthens and changes my relationship with language, and so with my own poetry. That said, there aren't that many hours in a day. So I find that I am definitely, a friend told me, this is something a teacher told her, I think, that there are ox poets and cat poets, and the ox poets are the ones who sit down every single day and make themselves work on a poem of some sort all the time. And the cat poets are the ones who sort of bide their time and do other things, and then suddenly sort of they seize upon something, and I am a cat poet for sure. Um, and I have come to start to make my peace with that. And it doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about poetry, or that there's a part of my brain that isn't sort of, I am always sort of nursing something that eventually I hope will turn into a poem. But I am not a chain myself to my desk every day sort of person when it comes to poetry. And yet it always is what I'm trying to return to and what I'm trying to cultivate in myself and in my practice. And yeah, and I think the balance certainly has changed as I have become a full-time independent translator, usually juggling a bunch of different kinds of projects at once, both prose and poetry.
Has it changed in favor of poetry or against poetry?
Generally against, I'd say. And I think I'm also just trying to think about it that way, that there are phases for the balance to change. And I love the translation work I'm doing, and it feels like a time to be devoting a lot of hours and energy to that. And so, but there, even within that, there'll be a sort of certain number of weeks when, if my sort of to-do list is a little shorter and I'm feeling a little calmer, where pretty instantly the poetry sort of rises again, and it feels like there's more space, headspace, to write in a more focused sense. Mhm.
So, amongst those literary translation projects, and in particular, what are you working on at the moment?
Right now, I am working on two poetry translations. One is by the Colombian poet Eliana Hernandez Pachon, called La Mata, which I'm translating as The Brush, which is a really remarkable, harrowing, sort of polyphonic collection of poems about a paramilitary massacre in Colombia in the year 2000, and the sort of responses of witnesses, of researchers, of journalists, and of the land itself as a sort of a kind of the landscape as a character in a way, witnessing and responding. Also, a collection by the Mexican poet Rodrigo Flores Sanchez, called Ventana Cerrada, Closed Window, which is a very wonderfully multi-genre. It has photographs and intervened, sort of modified photographs, and it's a kind of exploration of memory and family and how we sort of construct our memories of childhood and the sort of the world around us. And I'm working on a few prose translations as well. The very first novel by the Argentine writer who lives in Spain, Andres Newman, called Bariloche. A novel by a Colombian novelist named Cristina Bendek, called Los Cristales de la Sal, Salt Crystals, which is, I know you've spoken to Carolina Orlaf of Charco Press. It's coming out with Charco. And I'm doing another project for Charco as a co-translation, which has been very exciting to get to work collaboratively with the translator Ellen Jones, who is a wonderful British Mexico City based translator. And this is the first novel by the Mexican writer Ave Barrera, called Puertas Demasiado Pequeñas, which we've translated as The Forgery, not one of those non-literal translation titles. And so that's been so exciting to I just learned so much from Ellen, and it's the first time in earnest that I've worked on a co-project in prose and a whole novel.
How does it feel you know, as opposed to like translating solo? Does it feel like a different, can you tell, obviously by the end it will meld together, but do her translations feel a little different to yours, you know, textually almost?
They do a little bit, and that's a lot of what we, as we go back and forth, that we're talking about, and some of it has to do with those sort of very personal, just stuff that you start to notice about your own habits and the other person's habits and how they phrase things. And some of it also, I feel like it's sort of a translation and a half because she's from the UK, I'm from the US, and our Englishes are very different. I mean, it's constantly amazing to me just how in colloquialisms, in tone, and also dialogue, you know, there are so many differences. And so and Charco is a UK based press, and so we're tending more towards UK English, but we want to make sure that there's nothing that completely wouldn't make sense to a reader of English in a different place. So we're always negotiating those things, which is often very funny. Also, just sort of, you say that, you know, you say that, you know.
My half of my family is American, and
Mm.
my, when I was little, my grandmother and I made a book that was like
Oh,
American English and British English, and I've still got it. It's like this spiral bound book where we've got to
amazing.
like clip art and like put clip art pictures on the page with like all the words. It's so funny.
You should publish that. Yes.
I don't think it quite reaches the nuances. It gets stuck on sort of, you know, the things that you find funny at those ages. And it doesn't quite get to the nuances of like rhythm and tone, and more focuses on
Fair
like
enough.
trunk of a car and, you know, boot of a car. Yeah.
Nonetheless, much to be learned. Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
Robin, I can't thank you enough. Your love of poetry and everything that you brought for with it today has been an absolute joy.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been such a joy for me too. And thank you again for having me. It's just lovely.
Not at all. I'll see you next year.
See you soon.
If anyone wants to check out Robin's other talk, it's linked down below, as is the rest of the festival. If you're able to donate, we do have a Patreon. And yeah, see you all soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Bye.